Well, good morning, and thank you all for attending our panel this morning, which we've called "Is it Time for an Atlantic Free Trade Area?" My name is Tony Van Duzer, and I have the happy task of welcoming you to today's event on behalf of the sponsoring organizations, which are the CN-Tellier Chair in Business and Public Policy, which is located here at the University of Ottawa in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and held by my friend and colleague, Professor Patrick Leblond. We also have as a sponsor the European Center for European Studies at Carleton University and the Hyman Soloway Chair of Business and Trade Law, which is the chair that I currently hold at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. Now, our subject today is a possibly significant, but significantly under-examined development in the international trading regime, and that is, as I just mentioned, the development of an Atlantic Free Trade Area, or an AFTA. Unfortunately, our main principal speaker today, Professor Armand de Mestral from McGill, has spent considerable time thinking about these issues. You may have seen some of his writing in the last year on the website of the Center for International Governance Innovation. And Professor de Mestral will essentially lay out the case for an AFTA, an Atlantic Free Trade Area. And then we'll turn to our internationally diverse panel of experts who will comment on Professor de Mestral's presentation, as well as to address the desirability or not of an Atlantic Free Trade Area in general. With that very brief introduction, I'd like to turn things over to the moderator for today's panel. That is Crina Viju-Miljusevic, who is an associate professor of European Economic Integration at Carleton University and the associate director of Carleton Center for European Studies. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Viju-Miljusevic.
Thank you so much, Professor Van Duzer. Welcome everyone. It's great to be here and to have such great experts on the area. Given the short time, I'll go ahead and briefly introducing the main speakers of today. Armand de Mestral, Professor Emeritus and Jean Monnet Chair in the Law of International Economic Integration at McGill University. His areas of interest are international trade law, law of regional economic integration, European community law, Canadian and comparative constitutional law, international environmental law, international humanitarian and human rights. He has written extensively on international trade law and on Canadian comparative and constitutional law, international law, and he has served on WTO and NAFTA dispute settlement and arbitration tribunals. And he also was made member of the Order of Canada in December 2007. So with this very short introduction, I would welcome Professor de Mestral for his introductory arguments. And I will just want to remind you, Professor de Mestral, that you have about 20 minutes we are looking forward to hear your opening remarks.
Thank you very much indeed. Does everyone see my shared?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, that's too bad. Where are we?
Armand, can you see the share screen button at the bottom?
Here we are, and I'm clicking on the shared on my notes.
Oh,
okay.
Here we are.
Here we are.
And now slideshow. There we go. How's that? Good. Thank you very much. I apologize. Well, thank you so much, both Tony and Crina, for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank, in general, the organizers at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, also the Carleton University Center for European Studies, as well as CG, who have been kind enough to publish a couple of my modest proposals in this area. And I thank also, in anticipation, the commentators, friends and colleagues who have kindly agreed to participate in this event and give their response to my proposal. Now, I'd like, I think, as I begin to stress that my proposal is not a defensive or a negative one. I really believe that the case is essentially positive. It should be good for all concerned for a variety of reasons that I'm going to try to set out. And these reasons are, of course, beginning with economics, but they're also political and moral, in my belief. So you may say I'm setting out on a quixotic event, but as I say, I do believe that we're looking at something that should be seen very clearly in broader terms, and not just political and moral as well as economic. And fundamentally, it seems to me that Western democracies at this time in our history need to stand together. There are a variety of pressures upon us that are in some ways very strong and may well weaken our common commitments. And so my belief is that Western democracies really should be standing together. And if you'll allow me to coin a phrase, if we're not for ourselves, who will be for us? Now, what, in my view, what's my concept of an AFTA? It's a free trade area. Like, quite clearly, I'm talking about a free trade area, but one which would be drafted with as close ties as possible in the context of a free trade area. It should include all the North American CUSMA parties, all the EU, now the UK, European Economic Area, Switzerland, and those candidate countries still in the Balkans, but I would not include Russia, etc., in the Caucasus. Possibly later we might consider extension to highly related countries like the Caribbean, but that should be for the future. And I see it as both an economic commitment, but also a commitment involving security and common political commitments. And this can be done. The other free trade areas have been done essentially for non-economic as well as economic reasons. And an AFTA would not be any different from these. I'd also mention, of course, it would be the largest free trade area in existence. But I note that there are, in fact, a number of other very large agreements which now exist, and there seems to be a tendency towards larger and larger free trade areas, such as the major African free trade agreement that is in process of being concluded, the TPP in Asia and North and South America, the Chinese-led RCEP, which of course is a very big one, the Andean Pact, which is something that's been around for a long time, or the European Union, the most successful of them all. So a large free trade area in itself is not necessarily either impossible or unacceptable. Now, what would be the elements, in my view, of an AFTA? I believe as broad coverage of free movement of goods and services and intellectual property, in the sense that restrictions to the entry of these goods, services, and IP would be removed by all the member countries. I believe the focus of such an AFTA should be on future issues such as intellectual property, which has now become the principal source of wealth in our countries, the regulation of the internet, regulation of artificial intelligence, and something which I'm going to come back to, setting common standards of market access, which I believe is very important for us all. I think we could also envisage common approaches to both taxation of internet services, but also other aspects of taxation which are currently under consideration at the OECD. I think it would be highly positive if an AFTA could take on these proposals from the OECD. Equally, I believe this could be a forum to deal with new themes of common interest as they arise, and they certainly will arise in the future. And Western democracies at the moment don't seem to be very well equipped to deal with these newer issues as they come. And there's a danger that we may deal with them individually rather than as a group. Certainly there will have to be institutions, probably fairly serious institutions, and that's not always easy with a free trade area. And we're not dealing with a common market, of course, and I have no idea that this common market, this free trade area would have independent regulatory authority. I'm certainly talking about a free trade area, not a common market. There should be an effective dispute settlement system. And I would suggest that it ought to be stronger than that which is currently found either in old NAFTA or the CUSMA. Ideally, I think it should be binding and obligatory. And I say that because the experience of previous free trade agreement dispute settlements is that if a member state decides to go to the WTO, rather than using the dispute settlement provisions such as the ones in NAFTA, the WTO provisions override and have been interpreted as overriding those of the free trade area. I think in this case, there's an argument to be made to give priority, at least in the first case, to the dispute settlement provisions of the AFTA. Finally, in my mind, an AFTA is an economic agreement, but it is clearly linked, in my mind, to security commitments and a broader commitment to democratic values. So that it is not simply an economic vision. Now, what would be the economic advantages? Well, a larger market for the start, greater opportunity for new products to be introduced. I remind you that the Chinese middle class is now greater than either the US or the European middle class. Together, however, this would not be the case. And we need size. We need size. Now, there's an argument against this, and I've read it, I've heard it, but to my mind, we still, with an appropriately drafted agreement which protects other values, we need the advantages of size. And I'll come back to the whole issue of competition with China, but this is clearly one of the reasons, but not the only one. In the WTO, if this group of countries approaches the WTO with common positions, this would both strengthen the WTO and would strengthen, of course, positions of the AFTA countries. Provides freer movement of goods, greater access of services throughout the territories of the member states. And again, something I'll come back to, the possibility of common regulatory regimes. I think this is a very significant issue at the present time. And an AFTA bringing together the many countries on both sides of the Atlantic would, I think, be able to stabilize and promote the adoption of strong and lasting regulatory regimes. And there is, of course, strength in numbers, which the AFTA would give its member states. Hopefully, the AFTA would assist in removing the necessity of many disputes in between the AFTA countries. We've seen long-standing disputes such as the Airbus, Boeing dispute. Hopefully things like that could be ironed out in the negotiations rather than left to be taken to the WTO time in, time again. Now, an AFTA must, I believe, be much more open than most free trade agreements to common standards on human rights, labor standards, environmental standards, etc. Equally, with respect to competition, I think we could strengthen the rather weak provisions that we now see in various agreements on competition. And this, as I've said, would assist in strengthening the WTO. And presumably, there would be a common commitment to the climate change agenda. That in itself, I think, would be a strong argument in favor of an AFTA, given the sheer number of important countries that would be involved. Now, I mentioned standard setting, and the question really is who's going to make trade standards in the future? And here we are, I'm afraid, dealing with the issue of competition, which is, I don't think at this point, overblown. Economists tell us that competition is really between firms and not between states. But I'm not sure that the president of China at this time believes that. I think he sees himself in economic and political competition with the West, and you see some various declarations of President Biden that appear to be picking up the challenge. And if you look at Chinese action, both in terms of its use of membership in various international organizations, as well as what it's tried to do in the RCEP, for instance, China is attempting to take over and influence heavily standard making with respect to intellectual property, telecoms, and goods and services generally. And I think we have to deal with this fact that it's not unreasonable that China would want standards with which it's familiar to be the global standards, but do we want that to happen? And beyond that, we're dealing with a potentially totalitarian regime. We've seen various aspects of this, not so much in trade policy, but in other aspects of Chinese government policy. They tend towards totalitarian policies. And I think this calls for a response, and the broadest and most powerful response that we can give, so much the better. One, hopefully, an AFTA would assist in avoiding dividing the US from the European Union on fundamental issues. More generally, I would say it would be an opportunity for the standards set by the AFTA countries to be taken to the WTO and to remain the global standards for the future. And similarly, I think the climate change agenda should be reinforced if it were to be supported by AFTA. So the commitment to common values, I think, is important and would be an essential addition to my vision of an AFTA. So we would be standing together not just on economic issues at the WTO, but on various other issues of a political and equally a moral position. I think we want, as President Biden has said, he wants to show that democracy works. And with a solid trading and economic foundation, it's much easier to make that case than if we're constantly scrapping with each other at the WTO. So it seems to me a common commitment to democracy and human rights as a complement to this trade agreement would be essential. Now, who benefits? I'm going to say everybody. Now, I've read a lot of and heard a lot of the criticisms of free trade. We've heard, of course, all the concerns about absence of production of drugs and essential drugs in the COVID crisis in various countries. And there's been a pressure to assert the need for greater economic policy assisting in developing local production of certain products. I think that kind of debate can be incorporated, can be dealt with in the establishment of an AFTA. And certainly between AFTA countries, and I'd remind you that free trade agreements work best with your neighbors. This is always the case. There's an invariable rule. There are many free trade agreements between distant countries, and they're valuable and useful, but free trade agreements work best with your neighbors. And certainly if it can assist in, and of course, the economies of Europe and North America are the most complementary in existence. So this should help, as I've suggested already, to reduce US-EU tensions. The UK will get its only chance of access to all these markets in a single agreement. And we read Switzerland today has stopped negotiations with the EU. They're going to need a little help to deal with their neighbors as well. And Canada, of course, has strong ties through various agreements with both the United States, Mexico, and European Union and other European countries. But we can still use an AFTA, I believe, to strengthen our access to markets in a single agreement rather than on a piecemeal basis. So how do we get there? This, of course, is something perhaps the commentators will have a lot to say about. We know the EU has said it is willing, both Madame von der Leyen and President Michel have indicated strong interest in strengthening ties with North America. President Biden, as we have learned, is most unlikely, for a variety of political and economic reasons, to embrace any free trade agreement before the congressional elections in 22, given the various political pressures that he's under. Subsequent to that, I think one could expect him to be willing, provided he comes through successfully. And it seems to me that by stressing security and common values, which the EU has always done with its trade agreements, may be a welcome support for President Biden in his own approaches to trade, and particularly in his values-driven positions vis-a-vis China. So it would also assist, I think, both sides in building on the climate change commitments that they have made. So it seems to me after 2022, the elections in the autumn of that year, there would be an opening to promote the common trade agenda and stressing all the values that we've looked at: e-commerce, artificial intelligence, regulation of data transfers, et cetera, and including, of course, labor, environmental protection, climate change. So it does seem to me there will be an opening. And I think Canada should be laying the groundwork for this, acting in anticipation. And my final word is let Canada take the lead. So there you are, quixotic or otherwise, there's my proposal.
Thank you so much, Professor de Mestral. You provided lots of food for thought, and I'm sure our panelists will have lots to say. So I'll go ahead and briefly introduce them in the order of speaking, which is in fact the alphabetical order. And I also want to remind our audience that you could always send questions on the Q&A, and I will certainly try to pose them when the time comes. So I will start with Özlem Atikcan, who is Associate Professor in Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. Her research focuses on European integration, framing theory, global diffusions on norms, referendum politics, direct democracy, political campaign, social movements, and politicization of trade agreements. Welcome, Özlem. Özlem will be followed by Marc Bungenberg, which is the director of the Europa-Institut and professor of public law, European law and public international law at the University of Saarland in Germany. His main fields of research are European law, common commercial policy, public procurement and state aid law, and international economic law, particularly international investments and WTO law. Welcome, Marc. Michelle Egan, professor and Jean Monnet Chair ad personam, School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C. Her current research interests are related to federalism and trade, political economy of Brexit, and future of North American integration. Welcome, Michelle. Ricardo Ramirez Hernandez is a professor at the Faculty of Law of the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the chairman of the International Trade Professor Association at the same university. He is also a founder and partner of RRH Consultores, which provides legal advice in the field of international trade law, and the former WTO appellate body member. Welcome, Ricardo. And finally, Sylvie Tabet, General Counsel and Director of the Trade Law Bureau at Global Affairs Canada, where she has been providing trade law advice and negotiating international trade and investment agreements, the last ones being the bilateral investment treaty with China and the Canada-EU trade agreement, as well as litigating WTO and NAFTA Chapter 11 cases on behalf of the Government of Canada. Welcome, Sylvie. So with that said, I'm sorry for not introducing you with all your work on this field. I wanted to be short, so to give you the chance to answer to Professor de Mestral comments and also discuss your perspective on the topic. Just remind you that you have about 7 minutes for your remarks. So we'll start with you, Professor Atikcan.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I very much enjoyed reading and then listening to Professor de Mestral's proposal. I fully agree that this is an important moment to have a conversation on the idea of an AFTA. I will start with some points that highlight the opportunities of such a trade agreement. Then we'll say a few words on how I think it all really depends on the framing of it. And we'll conclude with 4 specific points for discussion. So let me start by saying that I very much support Professor de Mestral's positive case, and I agree that the election of Joe Biden changed the political dynamics significantly and made agreements as such more feasible. In a period of recovery from the COVID pandemic, strengthening the economic and political ties between North America and Europe, and to gain power vis-a-vis the other parts of the world, particularly China, would be seen as important opportunities by all parties. It could also, I thought, provide a necessary large framework to diffuse some of the existing problems in the current trade relationships, for example, the uneasy post-Brexit relationship between the UK and the EU, or the failed negotiations of the TTIP. But I think all would depend on the way it's framed and the way it's politicized, how it comes to the agenda. As you know, I work closely on these concepts, and perhaps it doesn't come as a surprise that I'm saying this. By framing, I generally mean how a speaker's emphasis on certain aspects of the bigger issue can cause shifts in public opinion and politicization patterns. And we know that this happens more when the issue is complex and technical, And the success of framing does not depend on these frames' empirical validity. A frame is strong if it taps into topics that are familiar for the public, if it's emotional, if it's negative. That's how our brains are wired. And when it comes to trade, debates around trade agreements are highly compatible with such framing effects because the subject is quite technical for the public to easily understand, and the uncertain consequences of these trade deals for democracy, social and cultural norms make them highly emotional and contentious, which then increases the effectiveness of these kinds of arguments for the public. So arguments touching upon loss of sovereignty, loss of cultural values can gain traction quite easily. And I'm not saying that all trade-related arguments are emotional or misleading, but there can be lots of misperceptions. And Professor de Mestral says that in the AFTA case, there's perhaps less danger in public perception of free trade, giving an unfair advantage to the other party. But there are factions in the West, and there are differences when it comes to social values, social protection, food safety, cultural products, workers' rights. And I agree that these differences are actually small, but they can become magnified with framing and politicization. So to tie it back to this particular proposal, I would like to make 4 key points for us to perhaps consider. The first is the scope of the agreement. New generation agreements such as TTIP have quite a large scope, and this amplifies the framing effects that I was trying to explain. They often go beyond the custom duties and involve issue areas such as regulatory standards or access to procurement, government procurement, and these end up having complex distributional and social implications, and issues around healthcare, environment, food safety, consumer protection, labor market become controversial. And scope is therefore key. And a more limited deal might actually go further, if that makes some sense. It's an interesting thing to think about. And the second point is the timing. And we all know that from the past decades, economic anxieties could add to contestation of trade agreements, and opportunistic political parties could frame an agreement particularly negatively if the economy is not doing very well. So a question to the panel is it perhaps safer to wait to get out of the economic downturn from the COVID pandemic to perhaps avoid some of that? The third point is the relationship of AFTA to existing agreements. How does it relate to the TTIP or the CETA or the Brexit deal that was really controversial? They were all controversial in themselves, and the EU might not be favorable to this agreement if this is perceived, for example, as a safety net for any of its member states to leave the EU in the post-Brexit context. The EU will also need to clarify the added value of this agreement for its members and to offer safeguards for EU standards. And I'm thinking from the UK's perspective, although the proposal is very clear, I'm again talking about certain misperceptions in the debate that are possible. The UK would need to clarify to its very sensitive public that it's not retying itself to anything similar to the EU. And my final point, which is actually quite similar to what I just said on the relationship to other agreements, is on the concept of diffusion and the possibility of diffusion. So in the recent decades, we've seen that if another agreement has been negotiated recently, that experience could easily cross into a similar trade agreement. So the agreements raised against the CETA, for instance, were very similar to the agreements raised against the TTIP. So we would expect the hot button issues from the CETA and TTIP and Brexit negotiations to reappear in this agreement as well. So it would be important to proactively pitch the agreement, the AFTA agreement, as a different one, and to avoid certain types of criticism. And the security and democracy aspects, as Professor de Mestral suggests, would be important in that regard. And so would, I think, a leading role for Canada. Well, these are my brief thoughts for discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and we'll move on to Professor Bungenberg.
Thank you. I hope the mic's working now. You can hear me? Wonderful. Okay, great. So thanks for having me in this discussion. And well, I've discussed these issues with Armand already here and there, and I have to say I almost fully agree to almost everything Armand has suggested here. I just want to take up a few points. Armand pointed out it's all positive. Positive, it always depends on the perspective, and I would bet that there are some countries who would not see this approach so positive, and everybody benefits. Well, would really everybody benefit? Looking at this project of an Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, this would of course horrify our Chinese friends and probably also Russia. It would be a very, very positive approach from the North Atlantic point of view. I totally agree to this, and I think it is really necessary to dig into this discussion right now, because well, from my experience from the past couple of years reading seminar papers from students, and they get their information very often from the internet instead of doing a clear research, they tend to develop a more and more favorable positive approach of what Armand called a totalitarian system. I totally agree to this. So I sometimes wonder why so many students start to tend to be more and more positive towards China, even in Germany or the European Union, also here and there Russia. And there's this strong anti-American sentiments you find in the discussions that I think we have to counter, and for this reason we need to point out the positive effects really of an Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. Then Armand, you mentioned the competition of systems. I think it is the discussion of probably this decade, this century, this competition of systems. It's not only anymore about competition of enterprises, but these competition ideas, they have moved on. And here my key question would be, will we even have this discussion of an Atlantic Free Trade Agreement if China would still be a silent, non-important developing economy? Will we be discussing this idea? And I would say probably not. So you've actually addressed the China issue here and there, and all these discussions also in the European Union these days when discussing third country subsidies. It's of course China. It's China here, it's China there, and the European Commission is mostly trying to avoid, also when reforming trade defense instruments, that it is actually an reaction to the always getting stronger Chinese influence that we in the European Union and probably also North America need to think about trade defense instruments. And so this is probably also thinking in pure economic terms right now, some kind of a multilateral, not like the WTO, so rather regional plurilateral trade defense instrument. I think now moving on, I still have 2 minutes and 54 seconds on my stopwatch. I think the time really is ripe for this, especially when we do take a look at the EU-US issues. Nord Stream 2, probably we won't see any sanctions here, at least not right now. The Boeing-Airbus dispute, no countervailing duties, no retaliation here. Steel tariffs, we even have a joint statement from the European Union and the United States how to actually tackle the steel issues in the next couple of months or next couple of years. So this background, US-EU background, that is pretty nice right now. EU-Canada. Of course, we have CETA, and well, with CETA, also probably something for a longer discussion. I still hope we see a CETA really coming, because we are going to have elections in Germany in September, and the Green Party is really strong right now. Well, they are not really in favor of the CETA agreement, and we have not yet ratified a CETA in Germany. We are still having the mass claims of the German Constitutional Court there. So I just actually about an hour ago talked to a friend who's representing some of these mass claims, the German Constitutional Court, and he did actually let me know, well, it is not on the schedule there for the next couple of months. So we won't see a decision of the German Constitutional Court on CETA before the German elections, and afterwards we have to see who is in power. I, of course, hope CETA is coming. I've worked a lot on the topic in the past years, but well, who knows? But nevertheless, the time seems pretty good. Also from my perspective, well, it would not be really in conflict with WTO issues, because here in this, after we would more or less tackle points that well, are leftovers from the past 20-25 years of WTO discussions. I think it should be based on the common economic values. So this strengthening of a market-based approach with well, more on competition law, subsidies, how to tackle counter state-owned enterprises, more transparency in different issues. So from my point of view, these would be the core topic of such an agreement. But I see, well, last 9 seconds, and I always try to watch the time limit. So thank you for having me here and giving some ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll move on to Professor Egan.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon. It raises the first question that when I thought Atlantic Free Trade Area, I was struck by Özlem's narrative, because Atlantic to me meant North America and the EU. So should we consider an AFTA, and why? I think Armand talks about 3 rationales: the geostrategic rationale, to streamline the spaghetti bowl of existing agreements and sort of promote standard setting, trade facilitation, and especially in areas of prudential regulations, artificial intelligence, new technology, given the rise of China. And provide also a balance to the orientation we've seen to the Asia Pacific with RCEP, TPP, and ASEAN and Belt and Road Initiative. The second argument seems to be an efficiency rationale, cutting red tape, promoting a neoliberal paradigm, market opening, standards for market access. The third rationale is a values-based trade agenda, which is really protecting labor standards, gender equality, and combating climate change and diversity loss. And I think most people would agree with that. But the AFTA context is that Biden is inheriting a more protectionist trade policy and will need to really prioritize the consequences of China as a formidable geopolitical and technological rival. And I think that's going to be a priority rather than a free trade agreement, given the composition of Congress as well. We talked about ratification in Germany and elsewhere, but we also have to think of the domestic politics and congressional side in the United States. So it raises some questions. Is an Atlantic free trade possible? It raises the other question, normatively, is it desirable? Is it worth the effort? The second thing is, do we already have a semblance of an Atlantic free trade area, given foreign direct investment, supply chains, levels of commerce, and the number of foreign companies that are domiciled abroad? The third question is, what is an optimal agreement? And then fourthly, what constitutes membership in AFTA? Armand gave us a sense of the membership, but the question is it open? And will it marginalize specific groups or specific countries? Thinking about countries that also have democratic values like Australia and New Zealand. And then could it also lead to a lowest common denominator? Given the fact you have a heterogeneity of countries here, will it cause a race to the bottom, especially as we also want a race to the top in intellectual property or geographic indicators? And it would need to be ambitious. The business and firm perspective came up, but given the sunk costs that firms put into Mercosur, CETA, and particularly TTIP, it would have to really be, you would really have to have business buy-in, and they would have to see a deliverable. So the case could be made going all the way back to these agreements. Do you want a very small agreement that is about low-hanging fruits and tariff peaks, so to speak? Or do you want something more ambitious, as Armand is talking about, with common production, safety, prudential standards for goods and services, but then that relies on trust and equivalence. And we often focus on the negotiations of these agreements, but we have less interest, as Patrick has pointed out, in implementation and compliance. And equally important for a Canadian audience is the role of paradiplomacy and the devolution of implementation. How do we include subnational actors to ensure effective implementation and support, especially as we think about the fact that, a lot of our internal markets in Canada, the EU, Mexico, the United States are also still fragmented with regulatory heterogeneity. So some thoughts and prescriptions. How do we get there is what I think was raised. I think the first issue is, I think it's been raised earlier, but domestic politics can really intervene. We think about the Mexican electricity market, American procurement commitments, customs and inspections in the UK. And I think the focus now is on domestic economic recovery, and we're hearing a lot about economic nationalism and reshoring. So the second issue that is of interest to me is there's a divergence in patterns of integration between the EU and North America. And I think that might have, it has a profound impact on the relations between these two economic giants of the North Atlantic. The European Union, even with the shock of Brexit, approaches the world economy in a coordinated manner with a common commercial policy. But Canada, Mexico, and the United States, I take these countries because that's what I thought was Atlantic integration, is, each of them pursues its trade policy with sort of minimal consultation, and they've seen large swings. What I mean about that is that the smaller economies are dependent on the US market, and they're rocked by changes in US whims. And so Canada and Mexico have sought diversification in their economic relationships, CETA and CPTT, but they find themselves competing against different regulatory models. Geographic indicators would be the best example because it's different between EU, Mexico, EU, CETA, and the United States has very little interest. So here we've got, they have to contend with US trade interests and also different regulatory models. So the reports from the Council of Foreign Relations and the Bush Institute has basically called on policymakers to recognize their trilateral economic interests. Even those recommendations are talking about how do you have internal market liberalization further, both in border security, economic interest, political interest, amongst those three. Can you leverage North American negotiating power with third countries and the EU? So what I'm proposing and suggesting here is pre-AFTA, why not have a coordinated North American strategy with the EU? Having a North American strategy towards the EU would put these three countries on a par with other regional trade blocs such as ASEAN and Mercosur, which negotiate as individual states, but also collectively on trade. So I think the issues here, if I have time, cut me off, is that, I think there are issues that we need to think about this relationship in terms of multi-level governance. I think there's a lot of issues that we can talk about in a broader AFTA context. We can talk about industrial subsidies, resilience of supply chains, innovation, rules on foreign direct investment. But I think we also need that subnational level of coordination and cooperation. So my 3 points here to conclude is, I think, first of all, foreign direct investment, as you pointed out, is critical to critical infrastructure and technology transfer. I think this is a timely discussion that the AFTA could push forward, because we've now got legislation on CFIUS in the United States, the Investment Act in Canada, and the new EU scrutiny legislation. There might be even pressure on Mexico to address changes in domestic practices as well, including foreign direct investment in energy. So secondly, it could also be, how do we discuss these differences in rules between USMCA, Mercosur, Mexico and Canada agreements, and EU Mercosur? So we don't have what we used to have as a spaghetti bowl of requirements. And so the third issue, which I think is very important, is the issue of regulatory cooperation. That's really critical. And, you know, we've had a lot of this discussion before, so let's not reinvent the wheel. We've got regulatory cooperation councils to try and address duplicative standards, regulatory equivalence. But Armand said something very, very important. This is not about independent regulatory agencies. It's not about the federal government. This is really about private sector coordination. This is about trade standards, standards of market access, and the question is, how do we do that? So my concluding comment here is, in thinking about AFTA, do we need a North American strategy? Do we need a North American mindset to foster an AFTA mindset? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to Professor Hernandez.
Thank you, and thank you, Tony, for the invitation. I will try to take less than 7 minutes. I appreciate Armand making us think about this and have new ideas. And he was mentioning these 3 points about the political, moral, and economic aspects. And when you start with the political part, I am not sure that we are already getting the right messages all over the trade realm in order to be ready to engage in maybe another negotiation yet. And if you're thinking about building blocks, you have an ongoing negotiation on fisheries in the WTO, a very important, which will basically tell you where does the United States stand in many issues. The vaccination, the waiver on vaccines also is an issue that is being discussed now. And of course, one of my least favorite issues, dispute settlement. There has been almost 5 months without any country initiating a case in the WTO. So this gives you, at least to me, a scenario of whether you are in a moment where you could start thinking about yet another new block. When you are, and I go directly in the political to the US side, when you don't have enough messages from the US, because the US has been saying all the right things about globalism, about how they will engage with the world trading system, about how they will engage in the new themes, but we don't know yet what it will be the exact proposals and what would be the US part on that. So I don't think that unless you have this clear, you can engage with that. On the moral side, well, I just have an anecdote. The Latin Americans have been trying to integrate themselves for moral reasons for almost a century or more, and we haven't yet done that. So I don't think that's a good part. And let me get to the economic part, which is the important one. And I put the word in my notes, template. What is the template that we're going to use to start this? And I think goes to some of what Michelle was saying. So what would be the starting point in this discussion? And honestly, what you're seeing is tariffs. And it's so simple. What would happen in the world if everyone will lower their tariffs? Will there be more free trade? And at the end, many of the problems that we have been discussing is tariffs on steel and aluminum. We haven't reached further in the discussion. And when Armand talks about focus on the future, well, what future? what kind of disciplines do we want? Are we gonna yet again come back to the same template that we started in the NAFTA, maybe in the Uruguay round, and then tweak it, put one or more two obligations, and let's expand the template? Or does this agreement give us an opportunity to reflect on what we really want on trade, what we really want to regulate? What we have seen in the future is what happened in the GATT, what was regulated in 47, is not the same that we're dealing with. And I'm not sure that, Armand talks about regulation of internet, of artificial intelligence. Well, I wish good luck to the negotiators, and I'm glad I'm not a negotiator anymore. Because it's gonna be, it's looking into the future and trying to regulate protection of data, in which I'm not sure the US and the EU are on the same page. On climate change, I'm not sure the US and the EU are on the same page. On labor rights, are we gonna take the USMCA as a template for labor rights? Will the EU be agreeable to have their facilities be inspected in order to check whether they have violated labor rights? So again, I think it brings a lot of questions, and what I really don't want is that we replicate again the same template, put new obligations, make a twist of them, and say we have a new agreement, we're not a block agreement. And which I think we need to rethink how trade is being done, because when you talk about freer movement of goods and freer movement of services, you have to recognize a reality that nowadays trade in services and trade in goods is totally different. They are basically merging each other. And I haven't discussed 3D printing yet. So I think it's a good opportunity to try to get out of some ideas of let's scratch the template and bring a new template and start discussing the new ways of trade and the new ways of doing trade. And finally, as a last point, I think you're leaving out, and this goes to my heart really, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. And I think if you want to send a political message, I think the political message is totally wrong. To tell we are here, the Atlantics, and we forget about you. And at the end, any initiative has to factor at least Latin America and the Caribbean, at least put them in the discussion. Otherwise, this geostrategy that is trying to be played out, I don't think it would work. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to the last panelist, Ms. Tabe.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Armand and Tony for inviting me. Let me start by making my usual disclaimer. What I say is absolutely only my views and not those of the Government of Canada, in particular when it comes to a topic like this. I should also preface my remarks by saying that I'm a trade lawyer. I have been working in this field for a long time, but my comments will reflect a little bit of my background as a trade lawyer, and having been involved in CETA and heard some of the challenges and seen firsthand some of the challenges both in negotiating and the ratification of the agreement. Well, first, let me say that I won't take issue with the importance of strengthening ties on both sides of the Atlantic, the importance of regulatory cooperation and cooperation both in the WTO and outside of the WTO. That goes without saying. Now, I think there's also no doubt that it is important at this time for the EU and the US to diffuse existing disputes that have been allowed to fester, and in particular in the previous 4 years. At the at the same time, the question is whether an FTA is really the right mechanism. And in that, I echo perhaps some of Ricardo's comments and some of the comments made by earlier commentators. I think the reality is that neither the EU or the US have a real interest in contemplating anything comprehensive in the trade area. And so I think an FTA is probably perhaps an academic dream at this point and far from the reality. We have seen there's been reference to the challenges and the failed TTIP agreement. We know that there's been huge opposition, in particular on investor-state dispute settlement when it came to agriculture and agriculture SPS standards between the EU and the US. I think those are not going to go away. They were difficult. I mean, we could say, okay, we're not going to have investor-state dispute settlement in the agreement. That's one way of addressing it. There were fundamental issues on government procurement, level of access. As Professor Atikcan spoke of, the fallout of and sensitivities around Brexit would add an additional level of complexities. So certainly there are significant obstacles. There's also a great allergy, I think, both in the US and in Europe, to start talking about anything like common regulatory regime. But at the same time, there's a realization that there needs to be work on things like improving conformity assessment and looking at common approaches on certain things like technology governance, and AI. There are some obstacles that should be addressed right now, some challenges in the existing relationship that should be addressed right now. We've talked about, there have been references to Boeing and Airbus, and I think that there may be an impetus because of the China threat to try to resolve that and the cross retaliation that has been allowed to fester. I think both firms are interested in resolving the issue. Same thing on Section 202. I think on steel and aluminum, it may be difficult for President Biden to completely remove the tariffs, but there's hope that that is an issue that there may be a solution to slowly, if not immediately. The other big issue that I think many of the other panelists have talked about is climate change and the carbon tax adjustment. I think there's hope now that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, that the EU and the US may look for a more common approach. There's been some signals on the US side that not to set aside something like border adjustments. We know Canada's looking at it, as is the UK. So that may be something that, that there's hope that these issues could be talked about. I'm not sure that an FTA, and going back to Ricardo's point about the old template may not be the right place to have these discussions. I think just putting them all together may not be the best way of addressing all of these different issues. At the same time, on the purely market access side, the question would be, what is the additional value added? Certainly from Canada and Mexico's perspective, given that we already have an agreement with the EU, that the UK has now asked to join CPTPP. So, there's already some market access for Canada and Mexico. There may be some value for the US, but it might divert trade and the competitive advantage from Canada and Mexico. So I'll stop my comments at that, and hopefully we can have more of a discussion when questions come.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. I think this was a very comprehensive debate of Professor de Mestral's opening remarks. And I know it's not fair, but I would allow you, Professor de Mestral, about 5 minutes, a very short period of time to address all these issues that have been raised. But I'm sure you can do, a very short summary of some points that you might want to answer. And after we'll open up for Q&A. So again, for the audience, please send your question in the Q&A button. Professor, you are muted, so yeah.
There we are. Thank you so much for those really very excellent, remarkable, and very trenchant comments. Now, I think I'll just summarize my general response, because I don't think I can deal with all the excellent comments that have been made. I asked myself, in the long run, if there were an AFTA, would the AFTA countries be better off? Would it be to their advantage to have this new structure? And in my mind, as you can see, I'm arguing, yes, it would be. It would be. Despite the obvious difficulties, both within the AFTA countries, and of course, the issue raised by Ricardo, how will the rest of the world respond? So there are huge issues, but in terms of the interests of the, if you want to call them, Western countries, it seems to me it is in our interest to get on. There are many pressures on us right now. We can be weakened. We're not as strong as we were. We can be, and we will be further weakened by our own divisions, let alone by pressures from outside. So, in my mind, this proposal is an attempt to strengthen and the position of the Western economies and allow them to deal with the various pressures that are upon them. Not just China, of course, but many. So that would be my answer to those who say, you've left me out, you haven't thought about me. Because the second half, and perhaps I didn't make it sufficiently clear, it seems to me that a powerful AFTA would be a tremendous support to a reformed and strengthened WTO. And I don't doubt for a moment that WTO needs reform and strengthening. Its basic purposes and propositions, the fundamental rules, the deep structure, go right back to 1947. And people are saying, well, of course, 1947 problems are not necessarily the very problems we have today. Some of them are national treatment, fair treatment, remain constant issues. But surely there are tremendous new problems that ought to be dealt with and ultimately incorporated into the structure of the WTO, rather than the current situation where most of the new problems are dealt with by various countries. The associations of the willing get together and try to deal with new things that are not dealt with adequately in the WTO. So it seems to me, my second point, my second answer is, I see an AFTA as going to the WTO, strengthening the WTO, admittedly in the interests of Western countries, particularly on the issue of standard setting. Seems to me we want to maintain our capacity to set the standards for the world, which we have done with remarkable success up to now. But it doesn't take a long time to notice that the Chinese have gone on to that issue and want to set the standards themselves. So who's going to set the standards and how is it going to be done? My answer is create an AFTA with that purpose, and then you have to go to the WTO and strengthen the WTO in this area and in others. So those are my two answers to the wonderful comments and very trenchant comments that I've heard. One, would the Western economies be better off? Would they be responding to challenges that are real? My answer is yes. Secondly, this is only part of the process. The second part is to go to the WTO to strengthen and reform the WTO.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are open now to take some questions from the Q&A, and I do see a couple of questions here. So I'm going to pose them, and whoever feels could offer an answer, please go ahead and unmute yourself. So the first question is, what happens to in the rest of the world in this vision of limited, exclusive multilateralism? I would say I would pose a second question for the panel. I'm trying to. What is Canada benefiting out of this, and why Canada should take the lead, given that Canada has negotiated CETA and CUSMA as well as CPTPP? Given that the idea of a US-EU TTIP is still out there, I would think that is for the US, if anyone, to take the lead rather than Canada, as you, Professor de Mestral, have proposed. And I assume something also related to Canada. Would Canada benefit from leverage of more formal association status in EU, so that AFTA could also act as disciplinary factor on unilateral actions by superpowers of 2030, 2040? So I'll pose these questions and I'll go for one more round once we get your views on these points that were raised in the chat. Who would like to take on any of the three questions posed? Professor de Mestral, do you have anything to add to this in answering these questions, or?
Well, and I'm sure others are just holding back out of politeness. I'm certainly troubled and intrigued by Ricardo's plea, saying, and it's obvious. People would say this is Fortress North Atlantic or whatever, and we're not in it. We're excluded. Now, to my mind, we could do a lot at the WTO, and a united AFTA with a clear purpose and a clear sense of where member states want to go, by way of creating new rules and strengthening disciplines, I think would then be serving the whole world. But I agree. I mean, it occurred to me, of course, just as Özlem began her comments, what about Turkey? What would you do about Turkey? And would it be in? Would it be out? And it's obviously a political question. It wouldn't just be Turkey by any means. But as I say, my fundamental concern is that Western countries need to respond to the challenges of the hour, and you've got to look after yourself. But the second part of it is we would then want to go to the WTO and take a message to the whole world.
I assume I'll stay with you for a second, because the question was related directly to your ending argument that Canada should take the lead. And I think the question is, why Canada? When Canada is in a better position, let's say, having all these agreements, comprehensive agreements, as compared to the US?
Well, I think at this point, the US is not able, for a variety of the US administration has many concerns and would not want to take on such a huge idea, a huge negotiation. We've got at least a year and a half before anything is really possible. So some country has to lay the groundwork. Canada used to be that Canada was a country very skilled in laying the groundwork, moving things forward, encouraging the great powers to get on with the job. That used to be our hallmark. I would have thought we might want to try it again. It would be people say Canada's lost its role in life. Maybe we could find it again.
Thank you. Any of the panelists would like to take on? Okay, so Marc and after Ricardo. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So just 2 points, also actually addressing what Ricardo mentioned. Well, West Africa, West South America, I say it's a competition of systems, and we lose in this competition of systems against our Chinese friends. There's no question anymore at all about where's Africa, where's South America. So the Belt and Road Initiative, who asked the European Union, the US or Canada about the Belt and Road? Second point, again, competition of systems, as this is one of my favorite topics. Would this not also kind of force the WTO to, after some 20 years of Doha, nothing happening, force also other players to contribute proactively to a WTO reform if we go for a Atlantic Free Trade Agreement? So I always see the positive effects of something new. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ricardo.
Yes, just to briefly react to Armand and to Marc, what Marc just said. Let's talk about from experience what happened with NAFTA. And there was an optic effect and a real economic effect on trade disciplines. What happened when the NAFTA was signed? Well, we Mexicans were no longer called Latins, we were called North Americans. And that was true and that was real and that happened. And at the end, there was even a legal challenge under the LADI agreements, the Latin American agreements, for us signing with the US and Canada. But there was also a trade disciplines effect, which was NAFTA was then transposed to all other countries, to all other Latin countries, and Canada and the US signed agreements basically using NAFTA as a template. That's my argument of the template. So why don't we, instead of make a template, incorporate them in the discussion? And I think that's better. On the WTO, I will agree with Marc in another time, maybe 10 years ago, of what would happen if there was an Atlantic agreement to the WTO and try to bolster the WTO to reach agreements. I think the WTO is at a point now where it needs more than ever the EU, Canada, and the US to get out of the crisis. And the fact that you are going another way to sign an agreement, I don't believe it will send the right message. And at the end, it will give the wrong message and saying, why do we need the WTO? We restart again the template issue, and then we replicate what we signed in the attractive free trade agreement with all other countries.
Thank you so much. Well, the questions keep coming now. Everyone warm up to the topic. So I will take another round of questions. I pose a few of them, trying to combine them, and we'll use the time that is left to get your opinions on them. So one question is, what needs to be changed in the discourse around the US in Europe and EU in the US? And is there a role for the transatlantic diaspora? How they can participate in that discourse change in order to see such a agreement being successful? That would be one question, the role of diaspora. A second question is whether or not we can use the CPTPP encourage a broader membership in this agreement and using whatever Atlantic cohesion we can master to influence what goes in that agreement. That would be, so to use practically CPTPP as you know, a template and an enlargement of that agreement. And I assume a question that is coming you know, more and more is, we need to know what would be the strategy and approach of China to such an agreement. How do you think that China will react to an AFTA, if an AFTA will start being implemented, and what leverage points can China draw on? I would say I would end with a question saying that public support is less and less for these deep agreements, and thus why should we invest our time and effort in making existing mechanisms work better rather than trying to create something new that would be really difficult to actually get ratified. So this would be the question. Of course, the question of whether or not the US is a reliable partner and will take the lead. This is something that I think you have addressed in your comments. But again, lots of questions on a very different aspect. So whoever would like to take on in the next 4 or 5 minutes, any of those will be welcome. So Özlem, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for these questions. I only wanted to say something about the public opinion aspect and the questions about how this could be done perhaps differently, or is it worth it? I said the same thing in my comments about Canada taking the lead could actually bring a fresh angle, given the existing problems and existing sensitivities about the US in Europe in particular. I think it could be quite interesting to see a more active role from Canada to maybe diffuse that TTIP issue to some degree. And similarly, I thought maybe, again, it might be too brave to say it like this, but it could be maybe a more bottom-up process, maybe not saying completely, this is what we want to do straight ahead, but maybe it's more about, this is for people. That could be one way of getting more of the civil society and maybe diasporas and all of those kinds of different types of civil society associations more involved, because there have been lots of discussion in the previous treaties on transparency of these negotiations and the whole idea of, you know, why are certain things done in certain ways. So I think maybe if it's put more as a transparent, bottom-up people's, a treaty for people that will benefit people, it could maybe one way of breaking the mold, but just a thought.
Thank you. Anyone would like to intervene and provide any opinion on these questions?
I'll just very quickly throw out a comment there, because TPP, enlargement of TPP has been mentioned a few times. I think the thing to watch there is whether the US will actually join CPTPP. I know a lot of the partners like Japan are really pushing the US to join. It's a bit of an open question in the US. There's some say that, you know, that would be the good counter to China. If the US moves in that direction, it may be a signal that it is looking at trade agreements again. After all, you know, the US did initially set a lot of the agenda in the text for the agreement, so it would be a logical next step. So depending on how that plays out, it may give us an indication of what will be next. And with the UK also having signaled their interest in joining, that will also be somewhat of an Atlantic agreement, a Pacific and Atlantic agreement.
Thank you. Yes, Armand.
Well, following on those comments, I think these two questions suggest, well, let's make existing agreements work, i.e. get on with improving and making the WTO work again and reforming it fundamentally, or taking up other major agreements such as the TPP and not only making them work, but expanding them. Of course, TPP, one of the interesting aspects of TPP is it would be seen as clearly a challenge to China. One way of dealing with the China question would be expanding the TPP and of course, much of it being in Asia and expanding the Asian membership. And clearly the TPP is seen as a counterweight to the RCEP, and broad expansion of TPP in Asia would clearly send a message to China that they are not pushing for sufficiently high standards. British want to join, so maybe the TPP has a potential to become a global agreement. Not sure how the British are going to join, but but there we are. I guess this is the counterpoint to my own position. Make the WTO work, build on existing institutions and existing agreements, and this is much more fruitful than trying to create something new. For whatever variety of reasons, I'm not convinced to this, but I can see this as being a convincing and sensible strategy, and one which can be pitched to the rest of the world much more easily than something that would be proposed, seen as Fortress North Atlantic.
Thank you so much. So, okay, a last comment by Michelle, if you want. After we'll have to end.
The question was asked about why high priority. I think we're in trade fatigue here because of ratification and implementation. I also think the public don't see the value and benefits. It gets politicized as things like chlorinated chicken rather than, you know, the technical, regulatory, conformity, market access issues. If we want to push these free trade agreements, it's really sometimes states do it because of domestic structural reform. If we want to have domestic structural reform, we've got to have trade adjustment assistance. And then my last point would be diaspora. The diaspora is working very well with the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Irish are really mobilized in Congress to make sure that the British will not get a free trade agreement unless the protocol is, you know, is in place and works in the Good Friday Agreement. But is the diaspora, we've talked about the diaspora as groups here, but I also think we're missing the territorial dimension. When USMCA was being negotiated, there was a lot of engagement between provincial premiers and US governors. And so I think that beyond the diaspora, we need to think about the territorial subnational ties. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, I would like to thank everyone for being present today, for your insightful comments. We all learned quite a lot. I think we could have a benefit from another at least 1 hour of this debate. And with that said, I will invite my colleague, Professor Patrick Leblanc, for closing remarks. And I also want to draw your attention to an event that is organized, in fact, on June 1st on COVID-19 and European integration with Dr. Scott Greer from University of Michigan, and this is organized by the Center for European Studies. So we'd welcome you to that event as well. Patrick?
Thank you very much, Crina. Thank you to Armand, Özlem, Marc, Michelle, Ricardo, and Sylvie. I just want to make sure I don't forget anyone. Thank you also to Tony for great discussion, great panel, for organizing this, and everyone contributing their ideas and showing, in a way, if I can sum up the whole discussion in 5 points. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, and as Crina said, we could keep going for quite a while. But I think, first, and Armand made that very clear, is that there are a lot of issues, and others mentioned those things going on in terms of, how trade is changing, technology is changing, and evolving very rapidly, creating new issues. Obviously, the geopolitical dynamics are there, which, especially with China at the center of this, but not only China. So therefore, a response is needed. Armand couched it in terms of a Western response. This was perhaps challenged a little bit by others and saying, well, should it just be a Western or even Atlantic or North Atlantic response. Armand proposed this idea of an Atlantic free trade area as a solution to this. But as mentioned, lots of challenges. First of all, is there political support to do this? I mean, I'll quote Sylvie, who said, is this just an academic dream? And perhaps it is. But sometimes dreams are a good starting point for discussions and maybe arrive at some solutions. But clearly, yeah, political support is a huge issue. Related to that is obviously the question of who would take the leadership on this. It's the answer seems to be the US is not there yet. So who does that leave? Canada was mentioned as a potential leader, although others said, well, what's in it for Canada, really? Given that we already have trade agreements with, in a way, all the parties involved. So, why would Canada take on such leadership? What about the UK? The UK wants to be global Britain, although we see the challenges that is bringing to the British economy and in negotiations. Australia right now being the most important ones, and not to mention others. The EU, really, would the EU be the leader? So that's a big question. And then finally, if we acknowledge that there are these issues that need addressing, including WTO reform, well, is AFTA the best solution? I think that was really the one of the questions. Or should we use existing mechanisms and agreements out there, whether it's the CPTPP or others? Or should we be looking, as Özlem mentioned, and also Michel, at narrower agreements on specific issues? Going back to Ricardo, who mentioned issues like AI and data. Are trade agreements the right venues for those kinds of things, or should we be looking at something different? More specific for governing these new areas, and that, as we know, trade agreements tend to be somewhat static. So perhaps we need something different, especially when it comes to standards. I've been advocating when it comes to data flows and data standards that maybe we should draw inspiration from what we've done in terms of financial governance, financial standards for the financial services and financial regulation. So maybe these are the kinds of examples that we should be looking at. So I'll leave you with this. I think this is the beginning of a conversation. I want to thank everyone for their contribution. Thank you, Armand, for pushing for this. And thank you for the attendees for being there. Thank you for the Center for European Studies, the CN-Tellier Chair, and the Hyman Soloway Chair on Business and Trade Law, and also the European Union, whose Erasmus Plus program is helping supporting this event. So thank you, everyone. Wish you the best. And as a vaccination occurs, obviously, in Western countries, for the most part, it seems, maybe perhaps we will be able to join in person at some point, but let's hope also the rest of the world will get our vaccine. So look forward to the next presentation on COVID-19 and European integration. I'm sure this will be something that will be discussed. So thank you, everyone. Wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you soon. And thank you to the attendees. All the best, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.